So you can see I've started with my rough-ish pencil sketch, which isn't exactly massively accurate or anything like that, but it's close enough for me to paint over. And I'm just starting off blocking in some basic values and textures, just a real rough, I guess what proper painting would be like, a bit like an underpainting. And with this one, I have no idea where I want to go color-wise. So I'm starting in black and white. And this is always what I do if I don't know what the color scheme's going to be like, because it's more important to block in your shadows and your highlights rather than get distracted by color at this stage. Sometimes if I'm working on a job where I know exactly what the colors are going to be, I'll go straight in with the color. And I generally do prefer doing that. But like I say, if I'm not sure where I'm going, we'll go with black and white. So I've kind of roughed in a bit of the background and switched that off. And for some reason, I've abandoned working on the background here and just decided to start rendering the Wanderer in a little bit more. And I do find that sometimes if jobs are a bit empty and they don't have some of the detail in, I find I'm uninspired by it. So I flip-flop between doing the big broad brushstrokes at the start and occasionally going in and rendering things a little bit too tightly at an earlier stage than you really should. And it's not particularly good practice, but I sometimes find if a painting's not coming along quick enough by blocking things in, I'll do that just to keep my interest going, really. And you can see at this point, I've started to render some of the lighting on the Wanderer, just to kind of, I suppose, give an idea of where the lighting's going to be coming from, which in this case is clearly from the left-hand side of the page. But you'll notice that I'll go between doing the big basic things and tightly finalizing small little sections as I go along, just as I fancy it. It's not a particular, like some people, you'll see them really work on one area and then move to the next as when that's finished. I generally just move around as and when I get bored doing something or particularly excited by doing something. But still at this stage, it's pretty much all about making sure your values are correct and just having something that would, from a thumbnail point of view, would look okay. Something that I learned a long time ago was that you do need to, even though all these covers are designed for being on probably 12-inch or bigger, for vinyl purposes and what have you, it's got to work as a thumbnail. And if it doesn't work as a thumbnail, the image can suffer greatly. Also, when you're looking on a computer, because so many people look at things on their phones, but also just if you sort of see something from a distance, it just doesn't look as good. And it's still something I struggle with slightly in making something look good as a thumbnail, because I've always been somebody who's a bit more detail orientated rather than someone who can make something look good with a few brush strokes. But it's one of those lessons that I'd recommend to somebody else, even if I'm not particularly following my own advice. And you can see at this point, I've started to work on some little highlights on those alien style pillars, which I think I took my kid to my daughter to some dance class and was sat in a coffee shop with my iPad, and I thought, what can I do? I'll just do something for 20 minutes. I'll just start rendering out these stalagmite style alien mountains in the background. And so for this bit with the pyramid, it's obviously got to be quite geometrically accurate. So I drew a bunch of lines in pencil and basically just angled them roughly to where I thought a vanishing line may or may not be. It's definitely not exactly accurate, but I didn't feel like in this piece it needed to be. And these lines are just going to provide a guideline for future rendering of steps and details. Because with something like this pyramid, it's all about scale in the background, and you can over detail. I find if you over detail something in the distance, it can almost look too close and not monolithic enough. And again, this is something that other people do far better than I. But making something in the background look massive is kind of a skill. Since I did this cover, I've actually since learned that you can set up perspective grids on Procreate, which is the program I'm using just here, and it's extremely useful, and I've used it on a couple of covers since I did this one, but I didn't know at this point. But I didn't really think that with something like this, an exact perspective grid is really all that necessary, because it's not a particularly accurate geometric drawing. There's no complicated architecture. It's somewhat surreal. So I figured you can get away with, as long as it looks about okay, it doesn't really need to be highly accurate. At this point, you can see I've started to just carve out a few of the steps on the pyramid, because I think at this point I wanted that. I mean, it's probably the most important focal point of the piece, really, even though the wonder is at the front. It's the pyramid in the background that you're looking at. I didn't want the pyramid to be an afterthought. So at this point, I'm just going in and notching out a few little bits of detail. You can see the screen occasionally flickers, and that's when I'm testing out brief, like going back to the sketch very briefly with none of the rendered background, or sometimes it's experimenting with contrast or levels on the layers, which is something I do an awful lot, because I do like to make up things as I go along, whereas some people I'm sure have a very defined plan of exactly what they're going to do with the cover. I'm somebody that I need to see things as I go along, and happy accidents often shape the way a cover will turn out. And I figure with something like this, because it's in the distance, you don't want you want the steps to look roughly level, but not so unweathered that they're a bit boring or, I guess, overly perfect. So I just went in possibly with a tiny fine little oil brush or something. Not not that you can see at this resolution, but a tiny fine oil brush to paint in those details. I mean, for the most part, I've been asked this quite a lot over the years, what brushes I use, as if there's some sort of magic to any of that sort of side of things. But realistically, I often just use the big round airbrush or a hard round brush for doing the big broad brush strokes, and then go in with either a small oil, like I'll blend something, occasionally blend something with a mixer brush, but then just go in with a little oil brush, something that's a bit more textured than a standard round brush, and that stops it from looking too perfect. Because one of the things that I'm sure everyone's aware of with like a lot of digital artists is it can look overly digital, which is absolutely fine if that's the look that you're going for. But I mean, personally, a lot of my influences are more the traditionally painted artists. So I think it's always been an aim of mine to not make things look too clean or clinical, which can often be hard, especially if you're doing something that's quite detailed. And I find that detailing with rougher brushes especially helps with that. A lot of the time, I do a lot of my work in Photoshop, but for this one, I did stuff mostly in Procreate for the purposes of doing this video. And I don't have my two favorite brushes in here, which is a shame, they're a little bit rougher, and I basically just use them in Photoshop all the time. And at the very end of this piece, you'll see a bit of a jump in progress, and that's because I've exported it into Photoshop and gone over an awful lot of the areas with it's just a standard chalk brush and a kind of oil painty mixer brush. And that's been my process for a good number of years. So at this point here, it looks like I've started to detail out the sort of destroyed city in the background. And with distant cities, there's a bunch of retro sci-fi artists like Bruce Pennington who are absolutely fantastic at doing these distant cities where all the detail comes from the highlights. The basic form of the city is almost a silhouette, but because it's in the distance, he'll just start to accent one side of it with highlights from a light source coming off in the distance, and it looks absolutely phenomenal, and it looks like a highly detailed city. Yet in reality, it's a little bit more simple than it actually looks. But he's just done exactly the right level of detail to make something look like it's in the distance, and a highly realized piece of concept art, but without actually being rendered in too much detail to distract from the foreground. And because this isn't a bit of an alien landscape thing, I'm not using any references for this piece whatsoever. I'm just making it up as I go along. And for most of my pieces, I do use some sort of reference source. But with landscapes, I think within reason, you've got a bit more freedom to just make things up as long as you know roughly where your lighting is coming from. We've got some garish color coming on there as I'm starting to think about where this is actually going to go. But yeah, so normally on one of these pieces, I'll have little reference images of, you know, existing bits of art or photographs, if you're painting material, or faces if you want to see how lighting falls on certain people's faces. I'll have them floating around in this image, but I wanted this one to be clean, which is why there is no other reference sources on here. So like I say, it's just being made up as I go along. I do realize at some point you do need to think about the color before the piece becomes too finalized, because I don't like coloring by filters. I find it's not it works for certain types of things if you're only using minimal color, but I used to do that in my early days, coloring via a filter or a color layer, and I was never overly happy with the result. So often in black and white, what I'll do is I'll do that as a starting point, but then go in once I know roughly what the color is and paint over the whole thing again in color, and it just comes out with a better look for my personal tastes. And as you can see in the top left, I've started to work up these ancient deity, creature, mysterious things in the background, and their sort of spidery webs, whatever's going on there. And this is all sort of little, points of storytelling, and you can look at the song titles or read the lyrics and come to your own conclusions. But it was all things that I discussed with Josh in relation to the Dormant Darkness concept. Okay, so I'm back to working on the Wanderer figure and just going in a little bit, and rendering the background behind him. Oh, I think this could be because I decided to shift the guy. Yeah, there you go. One of the things about this is the perspective isn't perfect, and the distance. I tried to create a bit of distance in it. It's not exactly accurate, but with a slightly surreal alien piece, I feel like you can get away with something as long as it looks quite fun to the eye. It's not the exact accuracy of the scale and the distance isn't as important as it is on some other pieces, especially as there's only one real character at the moment for as a reference source. Like if you've got lots of other people, especially in the distance, that's where if you don't have the scale of the characters correct, it can look all over the place. There you can see my original sketch, which hasn't changed. It's kind of getting a bit irritating now that I've shifted the Wanderer about a centimetre or so down. Oh yeah, this was after a little discussion with Josh. One of the bits of foreground metal he thought looked a little bit like the Roman centurion, the top bit of his helmet. So we decided to make a little Easter egg, harking back to previous Buried Realm album covers by turning that bit of space metal into whatever that brush thing on the top of a Roman centurion helmet is called. It's kind of like an ancient artifact. I don't know how many people will pick up on that, but it's when you see it like this, it's fairly obvious. And as you can see, I've imported a little reference just so I can get an idea of exactly what I'm meant to be drawing. Because for things like that, you can't just make it up I certainly can't make it up on the spot, and my memory recall isn't good enough. So I always find it very handy to have something like that just next to my actual drawing, so I can copy from it. Most of this is done on only a few layers as well. Like, I don't really like to work on too many layers if I can avoid it. If things are going to change, like position, like for example the Wanderer, that's it. But generally, I'll constantly be flattening down layers as I go along. Just so for one, you've only got so many layers that you can work with in Procreate if you've got a big file size. But just so files don't get too busy and don't have this separated look, and it does mean you've got a little bit less flexibility. And again, in my earlier days, I used to work on hundreds of layers, but now realistically, I just like to work on one or two if possible. And then if there's going to be any moving parts, figures, for example, They're always done separately and at some point flattened down. And here we've got another wanderer who's turning to ash in the wind. And he was always part of the original plan. I can't remember if I shifted him about a bit. But again, just kind of making it up as I go along. And the silhouette here was the most important thing. And there can be very much a tendency to try and over detail little characters like this. But the problem is if you do, it starts to look too... the detail actually works against you once it's in a final piece, and it's going to be a bit distracting. So realistically, this is all about capturing the silhouette and maybe a little bit of rim lighting and letting your imagination do the rest. This is one of those things, I suppose, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a lesson or anything, but as things get further into the distance, they've got less and less contrast. Oh, there we go. We're looking at the skulls here. So yeah, I imported another little skull for reference. I'd sketched one out roughly because I know most people know what a skull looks like, but it's always handy to just use another little bit of reference source just so it's a bit more accurate, just where the light falls. So what I'll often do is I'll sketch something how I want it to look, and then I'll have a quick look on Google to see if there's something that closely matches the light and angle of what I'm wanting to draw, and then you can sort of make it up between a couple of references and what your sketch looks like and get within the ballpark of something accurate. Obviously, for real human faces, if you're actually drawing a celebrity, I often stick very tightly to the reference image because you have to, because some people are incredible at capturing exact likeness, but I find that really difficult. But with something like a skull, all it's got to do is look like a skull with the lighting being accurate, so you can get away with blagging things a little bit. At this point here, I'm just starting to render out a little bit more of the foreground and the landscape. And I guess the idea here was to have a sort of sandy desert, but that's also a bit more alien. So it doesn't just look like a classic Earth desert. Because the original, here we go, coloring. So I quickly imported a color layer that I did in Photoshop super quickly, and just plopped it over the top. And at this stage, it looks kind of horrible, but you're getting an idea of what it could look like. And I became aware that I really wanted to do something with bits of the accents to be green. I hadn't quite figured out what the rest of the color was, but I wanted it to look cosmic, but not overly spacey. So as you can see with all these flickering lights, I'm experimenting by just trying to get something down that starts to appeal to my eyes and look like not a garish cover, but something that would capture your eye. And I'm a big fan of green and purple, which I'm sure anyone who's familiar with my work will know. And this one just happened to start gradually going from green and orange and pink to green and purple, which is, something I've worked with quite a lot. At this point here, I've started to figure out that this is what the color scheme is going to mostly look like. And it still looks a bit horrible because it's just done with color layers over the top. But as I'll go on, I basically keep painting on top of this now with the color palette that I've established. And that will dictate what the final piece will look like. And I'm still flickering around with different layers, just checking back to see if I didn't prefer a previous version. Because there can be a tendency to just think whatever the newest thing is looks the best, and I do often find that I'll go back and just check to see if actually maybe a previous version wasn't in fact better, and I can make a decision based on that. So at some point now, I know this is going to jump heavily forward in progress, and the reason for that is I've got a lot of my rough working down, but it still has just the markings of big round brushes in Procreate, and I much prefer the look of the chalk brush stuff that I'll do in Photoshop. So at some point in time, I will import this into Photoshop and basically just go over it with the chalk brush, which has a lovely texture to it. And that's what I do I used to do entire covers using that brush and that brush almost alone, but I find it to be quicker to go in with a round brush these days and do the bulk in Procreate, where I can sit in front of the TV, as opposed to sitting in front of my iMac all day. Here you can see I'm starting to put in a little bit of red into the underside of the planets and into that slightly cosmic smoke coming in the distance. And again, this is something that I've learned as I've gone on, is to have just a few more colors than I'd have previously put. Like I used to have very strong single or two colored album covers, whereas little accents here and there of different colors, you might think that it wouldn't work. Oh, here we go. So as you can see, it's taken a big jump forward now in, I suppose, detail and quality. And that's basically because I've probably gone and spent about 4 days or a week tightening it all up in Photoshop, but I can't unfortunately show that part on here. But as you can see, it's exactly the same process. It's just done with different brushes and on a screen that's about 3 times bigger. Oh, and there we go. I decided to add in another skull. So I found one that was roughly in the kind of angle that I wanted. Again, just a reference image. Copy it, plop it down there. It's just a small detail, and then tweak the colors accordingly. I often find like putting things like that in at the end, it always just adds a little bit more for undetailed areas. And I think at this point, I'd spent so much time on this cover that I realized that I needed to probably call it a day. So I sent it to Josh to see if he wanted anything more done to it. And he was happy with how it was. We discussed a couple of other things, but again, these wouldn't have been bits that necessarily made it any better. But and that's something that's worth doing. I've always really struggled with this at the end of a project, is to know when to stop, because you can end up spending hours and hours doing details that don't actually make a piece any better. And I'm sure that's why deadlines sometimes help as well, because they force you into just calling it a day at some point. Because quite frankly, I can't remember who said it, but art is basically never completed. It's just abandoned once you're happy with it. I'm paraphrasing that badly, but it's very, very true. So there you go. That's about 20 odd minutes of running through it. I don't know how helpful or useful or interesting that was to anybody, but thank you for anyone that's decided to persevere this long. I'll try and do more of these later, but no promises, because it's quite a faff. And as well as taking quite a lot of time to do, I just find the fact that I need to flick in and out between programs makes it a bit more of a pain to do this, rather than if I just work completely in Procreate. Like I say, I wouldn't have chosen to do quite as much of the heavy lifting on this one in Procreate, but it was useful for the purpose of doing the guts of a full album cover, so I could do a video. Anyway, thank you very much. See you later. Bye.